Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Women in Literature 2021. This is a literary festival that seeks to celebrate the written word by females. It has been organized by Sabine Muzaffar, who is the founder of NNK. Thank you, Sabine. Thank you, NNK, for giving us this platform to share our thoughts here. The panel that is currently taking place is Translating Women, the impact of gender and translated work. This panel seeks to explore whether gender factors in when translating a work of literature. Does gender impact and influence linguistic styles, perceptions, and interpretations? Regional literature, and especially that by female writers and authors, is more than likely to fall prey to linguistic resistance. This panel strives to investigate the gender shift in translation from one language to another and broaches the argument that translation does not happen in a vacuum, but the argument that translation does, but in a continuum as part of an ongoing process of intercultural transfer. I'm delighted to introduce my panelists. We have with us Dr. Amina Yaqin, who is a reader in Urdu and Postcolonial Studies at SOAS. She is chair of the Decolonizing Working Group and the director of the SOAS Festival of Ideas. Her monograph, Gender, Sexuality and Feminism in Pakistani Women's Poetry, is forthcoming with Anthem Press in 2021. She is co-author with Peter Moray of Framing Muslims, Stereotyping and Representation After 9/11, and has co-edited several publications, including the first one being Contesting Islamophobia, Media, Politics and Culture, Culture, Diaspora, Modernity in Muslim Writing. Her research is interdisciplinary and engages with contemporary contexts of Muslim life as well as the politics of culture in Pakistan, where she grew up. She has been part of two projects: the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded International Research Network on Framing Muslims, as well as the Research Council's UK funded Muslims, Trust and Cultural Dialogue. She is a book series co-editor on multicultural textualities published by Manchester University Press and on the advisory board of Anthem Studies in South Asian Literature, Aesthetics and Culture, the Pakistani Journal of Women's Studies, Journal of Research, Humanities, Punjab University, and the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. Dr. Yaqin is the founding chair of the Center for the Study of Pakistan at SOAS and the co-founder of the Center of Gender Studies. Thank you, Dr. Yaqin, for being here with us today. I would also like to introduce my colleague. Mina Malik Husain is a writer and poet based in Lahore. Her literary work has appeared in Valam, the Alif Review and Scroll, amongst other literary publications, and she has had bylines in Architectural Digest, The News and The Nation, where she wrote a popular column for 5 years. Mina is currently enrolled in an MSc in Creative Writing at Oxford University, and is the host of the Coffee Table, a talk show on national television. Thank you, Mina, for being here today. And my third panelist is Dr. Nukhbah Langhah, who has served as an associate professor of English at Forman Christian College University since 2009. She chaired the Department of English from 2013 to 16 and served as the Dean of Humanities from 2016 to 20 at Forman. She did her postdoc from Le Centre d'études de l'Indie et de l'Asie du Sud, Paris, and was a Charles Wallace Fellow at SOAS. Her research interests include resistance literature from South Asia, peripheral literary voices from Pakistan, South Asian cinema, post-9/11 literature, regional languages and discourses from Pakistan, and translation theory. She is also a freelance translator, political activist, and a feminist. Her academic publications include a monograph, Poetry as Resistance, Islam and Ethnicity in Post-Colonial Pakistan. She's also part of an edited volume, Literary and Non-Literary Responses Towards 9/11, South Asia and Beyond, and a number of research papers based on society, identity, marginalization of women, relations with Poetry Translation Centre, London. Currently, she is a project partner lead for Forman Christian College University in Global Challenges Research Fund for a pilot called Advancing Female Literacy and Empowerment in Pakistan and India Through Life Writing with the University of Sheffield her upcoming co-edited work with Dr. Roshni Sengupta. It's called Film, Media and Representation in Post-Colonial South Asia Beyond Partition, deals with post-partition connections in South Asia through media and cultural responses. Dr. Langhah, thank you very much for being here today. Dr. Yaqin, I would like to start off with you. And this is a pet peeve, I have to confess. In Pakistan, we have seen many male authors who have written primarily in Urdu have their works translated, retranslated in English. But for some reason, our female authors remain untranslated. Why is this the case? Manto, for example, has been translated to death and beyond. Faiz lives on as if he was still alive, and that's all very well. But why is their work celebrated? What is the problem? Is it state, society, lack of Urdu, understanding of Urdu? Or is it, as Naipaul said, that female writers were unequal to his own due to their sentimental, narrow vision of the world?
Okay. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for that generous introduction, Mehr. It's wonderful to be here and to be amongst such a august group of women. And thank you, Ananke and Sabine, as well, for the festival. This question is something that really is at the heart of my forthcoming book as well, in terms of why don't we have more books about women? Why isn't women's writing in Urdu or in any other of the regional languages in Pakistan flagged in the same way that men's writing is? Because when you think about population statistics and you look at the kind of contribution that women make to society, it's so important that they have role models and that they see reflections of themselves in the writings and in generally storytelling. Stories, narrative and storytelling is such an important thing. So one of the things I found, actually, my book is a long project. It's goes back, quite a long way to when I did my PhD here at SOAS, and it's on feminist Urdu poetry. And when I started researching it, and I was going to Pakistan quite a lot for my research and talking to people over there, and it was mostly men that I was talking to, and it was really interesting in terms of often, and I'm very grateful to them for all the support and the help they gave me. But what was also quite fascinating now that I look back at that moment was how I was being told I should write that book as well, or how I should write my thesis on women's poetry. So what that opened up for me, or made me think about, was the gatekeeping that we have in certainly in Urdu literature, where there are certain group, and this happens, canonically across all literatures. You get that in English literature as well, that there's a very strong gatekeeping of who gets to be heard, who gets to write, who gets published. I mean, for those of you who work in publishing, you will know this from experience, that there is a certain kind of a sort of pattern to how you get published. So the other thing that, you said about state and a number of other things, and it's also about the kinds of stories that people want to hear from women, right? So it's what kind of storytelling are women allowed to do or is expected of them. So when you're part of a national ideology, when you are the bodies around whom the story of the Muslim nation gets centered and told, then there are certain things that you have to abide by. And also, the question of Urdu is a national language. It's not just a language of a particular group or the Muhajirs or some, people who are distant from the nation. So it has to communicate a particular type of message about what our national narrative is, what our national kind of ideology is. And that's not what I'm saying. That's the kind of, even when you say about Faiz and Manto, they are kind of translated and retranslated, but they're not necessarily central to how Urdu literature gets thought of in many ways. I mean, maybe that's not the right thing to say. They are central, but they are also some of their work is more central than other parts of their work, or celebrated more than other parts. And somebody who was very close to Manto, of course, was Ismat Chughtai. And I think what should happen is that these writers' works should exist, the male writers' works should exist in dialogue and in tandem with women writers who are making equal contributions and equal representations in their writing to what the male writers were doing. But the fact is that we just see one part of the story, we don't see the other part of the story. And the other thing I would just like to share is, for example, with one of the poets that I went to speak to, Zehra Nigah, for example, and I was talking to her about her poetry, and she said, look, when I did my first mushaira, or in the beginning when my name, when I was getting known, one of the things I was told was that, avoid raising your hand to your forehead as a gesture of acknowledgement, because you then replicate a particular type of courtesan culture that is reproduced in films and in the kind of longer history of our how we want to not be that kind of woman. But like Bollywood also stereotypes that particular representation of Urdu or Muslim culture, and so there is that kind of interaction. Then the other sort of question that Kishore Nahid brought up quite a lot was that when people talked about Zehra Nigah's poetry, they would say, well, that's not her poetry. She didn't write this herself. It's the question of authenticity. Like, is this person actually writing the work? Because they're a woman, how can they be producing this? This is their own writing. And yet when you go to bookshops, and I spoke, I used to spend all my life in Sangamil, quite a lot in Lahore, and they said a lot of the poetry, the writing that's very popular to be read is by women writers. And then I was also told the story that some of the men are writing as pseudonyms, as women write, as women. So, I mean, so many things that your question brings up. So I'll just kind of stop there and let you come in.
I find that hilarious that men were writing other women names to sell their work. That's something that I think I'd love to look into as well. So thank you for raising that point. Mina, I'd like to ask you, now Dr. Yaqin mentioned several elements which I find very interesting. That one, a particular type of story has to be written by a female writer. And I know that I've spoken to you about this as well, that how as women, we're expected to fit a certain role with the chiffon dupatta and the plate of kebabs, and that's it. And I'd like to ask you that, how important is it for young Pakistani females to start translating? And what is it that Pakistani females want to read? Because the consistent argument that goes against us is that there's nothing that they can connect with in modern day literature, especially for the past 10-15 years. What will be the appeal, or what will young female translators gain at this point in time? Apart from the literary experience, bearing in mind that our modern day Pakistani female is emancipated, strong, and constantly striving to carve out her own identity. Is language where the battle begins, given the brouhaha we've seen over the placards at Aurat March, especially the ones in Urdu? And why is there such a male hold on language? I mean, Dr. Yaqin sort of nailed it for me when she said that Zehra Nigah was told not to put her hand to her forehead, which is how I greet people as well. So I don't know what impression I'm giving off to others.
That's true. I was also sort of sitting here and rethinking all of the adabs I've ever done. Oh, gosh.
I think on public stage, I should just say.
Not privately on Eid.
No.
Thank you for that question, Mehr, which is, I think, very complex. I think that I want to sort of start with what Dr. Yaqin said about how most of popular writing is being done by women, which is true, because all the digests, most of them are written by women, and they remain incredibly popular even today. So I think that for me, the heart of that is that women's writing historically also all over the world has consistently been put in a separate category. The fact that we describe it as women's writing is telling in itself. And I think that it's interesting to examine how, particularly at least for the Urdu literature, and this ties into what Dr. Yaqin was saying about the kind of story that one ought to be telling as well, is that the female narrative hasn't been presented as the universal experience the way men present their work. So men's writing has always been seen as the universal grand narrative. And, you're talking about important things like war and violence and destruction and passion, and those are all male things. And when you look at the woman's world and you look at female writing and the things that are interesting them and absorbing them, and I'm working on Khatija Mastoor these days at Oxford, and it's fascinating because that kind of particularly female écriture, as it were, it's a very interior space, and it's a very particularly female energy to that, and that hasn't been historically seen as serious literature. And perhaps that is one reason why it hasn't been translated as much as it should be, or accessible as much as it should be, or read as widely, because when people want to read literature, then they will most likely turn to a male writer. So I think that's like one half of the problem. I think the second one is that when we're talking about the modern Pakistani woman, then that is also a sort of, one can bifurcate that also into groups where, let's say, the reader is a more fluent in Urdu reader and one is a less fluent in Urdu reader. And I think that the translation becomes particularly important for the reader and for the consumer that is less fluent in Urdu. So that's a question of accessibility. And yes, absolutely. I think the more translation that is out there, the more one is opening access to a very wide kind of readership, which will then obviously then not any English reading audience, which is then universal, that goes across the world. And we were talking about this earlier with Daisy Rockwell, for example, who's done some very good work with Khatija Sahiba's work. But I think that one thing that I want to just kind of pop in there also is how translation will also help these texts to be accessed academically. Because with my own work, and I'm writing a very extensive essay on Khatija Sahiba's work, also I find that there's a huge dearth of secondary material, and people are not writing in English critically about her work because it's not available. And then who's going to start doing that? And where? And then all of these students, I went to the Punjab University for my MPhil, and everybody wants to work on Pakistani writing, but it has to be in English. So if you have a translation at hand, then you can do the academic work. So that's also a very crucial aspect of having more translated work, especially by women, out there.
Thank you. Absolutely. I completely agree with you there. And on the basis of that, Dr. Langhah, I would love to know your thoughts on how translation and the feminist school of thought are connected. Feminist theorists see a parallel between the status of translation, considered to be derivative and inferior to original writing. And of course, what Dr. Yaqin had said, that the accusation that it may not have even been written by a female writer, and women who are repressed in society and literature. Would you agree with this connection? Is the reason for the lack of translated work in Pakistan specifically by female authors and the almost non-existence of female translators? Is there a connection between that and
Yes, thank you for having me here, Mehr. I would absolutely agree, because this is kind of we can see this as layers of marginality. For instance, in terms of gender, if women are marginalized, then the discipline of translation studies and the practice of translation is seen as of secondary importance. So that's a bit of a problem, particularly in the context of Pakistan, which is a country with diverse languages and identities. In fact, in general, translation is seen as an activity of secondary importance, because and the reliability on the translator is questioned repeatedly, even theoretically and in practice, because it is always reinforced that women, not just women, but any translator is, their voice is of secondary importance as compared to the source language or the original text. So in this respect, I do see, yes, translation, because translation is also sidelined, the activity or practice of translation. That's why particularly the works by women are sidelined as well. However, this is also an activity. Translation is something which is not taught as a discipline in a country like Pakistan. So let alone considering the work translated by women or translating women's writings. So in that respect, a lot of emphasis needs to be put on why we should teach or train people in translation, and how important is the discourse of translation. Because if you go back and dig out, translation played a very important role in the process of colonization as well. And normally, when I teach translation courses, we do engage in that discussion. However, it has how it has the dynamics of comprehending translation as a secondary activity is changing in particular contexts. And in that respect, Pakistan is an important context. So we need to rethink and review not only just why women's work is not translated or given importance, but also why the practice of translation or the discourse of translation is discouraged overall. I hope that addresses your question.
Absolutely, Dr. Langhah. Thank you so very much. On the basis of that, since you've made this extremely important point that translation is discouraged or it's not encouraged as much, Dr. Yaqin, I'd like to ask you, female writers such as Kishwar Nahid, Famida Raz, Kurutal N. Haider, Banu Qudsiya, Parveen Shakir, and Hasina Moin, who recently passed away, sadly. These are women who have produced rich literary bodies of work. And the fear that constantly haunts me is that, are they at risk of being forgotten? In this digital age, what needs to be done to ensure their work lives on and is accessible to future generations? How do we even begin to translate their work? Where do we start and give them their due credit, especially as post-colonial authors who are now, who since I suppose the 1980s have dared to own their language and identities? What do we need to do now?
I think that's a really important question. And with regards to what do we do now, I think Dr. Langhah and Mina have both highlighted the challenges that we face with translation studies and the recognition of translation. And then you're working with something that's on the margins, and then within that you're also working with women's, bringing to the forefront women's writing. So sort of double marginality comes into play. And I certainly empathize a lot with Mina, because when I was starting out my project on the feminist Urdu writers, it was a struggle to find writings that would be available on these writers. So in a sense, you have to create your own story, you have to create your own narratives. And here also, I think disciplines like post-colonial studies are very troubled in some ways. I mean, I am a post-colonialist, I work in that field, and I'm also a feminist, and there are interesting intersections between both those schools of thought in terms of marginality. But also, I think there are some questions to ask of post-colonial studies and its relationship to translation. Why does it have such, and this has been raised about this sort of discipline from various people over the past, especially people who work in the field of comparative literature, and comparativists will often work with texts in translation, and post-colonial literary scholars have, it's been said that their preference is for texts in translation. So are they also, in a sense, continuing the fetishization of English literature? I mean, I know from, again, I'll go back to the example of my book, it's certainly the case that when I approached publishers here with regards to publishing this book in English, many over the years, it was always a little bit of hesitancy. Well, who's going to want to read a book about translated authors in Urdu who are not kind of, a Manto or a Faiz or some. So, those are questions, real questions for those publishers, because they have to sell books and they have to make it marketable. But they also mean that the field becomes very narrow and very kind of closed, because you can't then bring into it new voices and new ideas and new thoughts. I mean, so that's sort of from a global perspective. From a national perspective, it's a question of what is the funding, what is the state doing with regards to supporting the work of translators and the work of translation. And that can, women's writing has the kind of reverberations of it are not just in literature, they're also in technology, they're in science. And it's when you see women from all those fields, their writing being translated and made available in the different languages, then it becomes possible. But if also in Pakistan, aren't we talking about a question of literacy? I mean, what kind of literacy are we working with? Rates? I mean, I know that, for example, television in Pakistan is used as a medium often also of education, right? NGOs have often come into Pakistan and communicated messages or educated publics through the medium of television. So we need to have a very honest conversation about where we are with education and how in that system, where can we make the maximum impact? And then, of course, that leads us to those narratives that we do get repeated ad nauseum on television dramas. And you mentioned the kind of legendary figure of Hasina Moin, and it's such a loss to us, her passing away. And you have lots of things in terms of memorials and things that are done, and I don't know what we'll get for her in the industry. But I think what we've seen since Hasina Moin is a real, since those dramas, and there were others as well who used to write quite hard-hitting dramas and certainly thought-provoking ones. And now you have a regression, which is perhaps a reflection of our politics, of our political climate, of the kind of return to conservatism, and the ad nauseum familial project of getting married and of living life in this kind of bubble that is very much a middle class bubble. And it is also a very dangerous way to make people sort of think of only this is the only way to be in society. And I think, to have the bungalow, to have the man, and to have, or not, for the poor woman to get rich is often through that pathway to marry a rich man. And it brings up lots of issues in Pakistan, of caste, of class, of sexualities. Are we openly even talking about these things? What is it? I mean, I think you asked that question previously. What is it that women want to actually read, when they read these books?
Absolutely. No, you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to literacy and television, and of course, what is it that women want? But Mina, I'd like to ask you something, keeping in mind what Dr. Yaqin said, and I want to tie it in what Dr. Langhah said as well. The gender gap in Pakistan is beyond wide. It's beyond wide. It's a shameful trait that the country is on the lowest end of the International Gender Index. There are very few female role models for girls to help them arm themselves to fight for education, rights. For example, we just have to mention Malala and you can see the divide on, even if it's just a casual setting or on social media, and let's not even get into formal discussions. Can our female authors, now bearing in mind what Dr. Langhah had said about the feminist aspect of it, and what Dr. Yaqin said about Hasina Moin and television being a means of communication and addressing issues, do you feel that if our Urdu books by female authors are abridged or made more accessible to young girls who are stuck within the confines of their homes, whether they go to school or they don't go to school, do you feel that this is the way to sort of put the seed in their minds with regards to broadening their vision and getting them to accept feminist theory? Given the lack of Urdu knowledge, Salis Urdu, as they say, classical Urdu in the terms of vocabulary, would translated or abridged work help? Because we've seen English being associated as an elitist language and how it undermines the very concept of being patriotic and nationalistic towards Pakistan.
I think that it's also a question, and I think this goes back to the idea of storytelling and narrative and who's controlling the narrative. And for example, I think a text that we commonly read in Urdu classes, and this is again, like I'm talking about Cambridge, the O-level, so that's pretty privileged to begin with. But Maratul Rus, for example, is this sort of standard text, which is like a terrible book, and it is the most regressive book about horribly stereotyped ideas and very rigid ideas about what a good woman should be. And that's sort of, when you're at this impressionable teenage age, that's what you're reading. And you're thinking, oh, well, maybe Urdu literature, this is just what it's about. And then naturally, it's not appealing. And I think that would go across readership. But then you have people like Khatija Sahiba writing, and their characters are fantastic, and they are feisty, and they are brave, and they're fighters, and they get things done, and they don't just sort of sit by and wring their hands the way that they do on TV, for example. And I think that Dr. Yaqin's point about the way that we consume TV is also crucial here, because that's another kind of narrativization, indeed very important when you do have low literacy rates. But what I find, and I've done a fair bit of work on this recently, is that the digest writers are the ones who are writing the dramas as well. So it's not a very far leap to see that the content in each is mirrored. And I think that is also a deeply feminist issue here, is that a lot of times women are the ones who are furthering this very particular narrative onto our screen. So you're sort of controlling every kind of storytelling, and it's all looking the same, and it's become an echo chamber. And it's all about, really, at the end of it, it's about consumerism, because people still watch them and people still read the digest and they keep watching the shows. But I do not think that's because our audiences are unintelligent. I think it's a question of the work that is out there, historically been out there, has not been brought to the fore enough and consistently enough for it to be as important as it should be. You know what I'm saying? It's like the impact of these books is immense, but only if you've read them and only if you know that they exist. And I'm not sure what contemporary Urdu writing from women looks like right now, because I'm not sure that kind of storytelling is happening. Obviously, I may be wrong. My readership is limited, and I'm sure that Dr. Yaqin and Dr. Langhah know better about it. But that would be something that I would be curious about, sort of, what kind of pushback is happening. Absolutely. But in terms, sorry, just a sort of last thing, I was thinking of the last bit of your question, is that it is true that I think reading in English, like for example, doing an MA or an MPhil in English literature is still an incredibly prestigious degree to have. So in that sense, maybe audiences who might not read it in Urdu because they might think that, oh, well, it's not fashionable enough, or they just wouldn't be motivated enough. Maybe it was there in English. Maybe they'd read it, something with, a pretty cover and, an interesting sort of way to present it might make a difference. That I first read in a Angan, in a translation by Mina Malik Husain, who did this 20 years ago with the CMOG Women's Resource. So I think that we can't sort of ignore the link between, our feminist drive to put knowledge out there and translation.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And with regards to your point about digest writers, that's true. That's very true. So one does need to examine the link between the TV dramas as well as the kind of writing that's taking place in digests. Dr. Langhah, we've spoken at length about the Urdu language and how it suffered, but I feel that regional languages have suffered even more so. And that's a tragedy. For example, the Saraiki language has suffered beyond belief. The language is at risk of being lost. Its scripture is at risk of crumbling away. Even ancient texts that many Saraiki families hold, they've not been digitized. And what, by and large, the texts also remain untranslated, although some families have attempted to translate them, but because the language, the essence, the pureness of the language has been diluted. Interestingly, these texts also lie in the hands of male custodians. Is gender an obstacle to overcome when gaining access to these ancient texts, to translating them to literature, in your experience?
Okay, it's a very interesting question, Meher, and I would say yes, absolutely. Particularly because I work on Saraiki translation, so I want to speak with reference to that context. That Saraiki socio-political domain is largely male dominated, and as a feminist, as an academic, as an educated woman who's also a Saraiki, politically conscious Saraiki person, I would say I find it very problematic. And I'll give you an example which generally audience might be able to relate to. That a few years ago I was asked to organize a panel on Saraiki literature um, for uh, for the Lahore Literary Festival, and I was abroad, but I had committed and promised to organize it, and I started contacting people, Saraiki writers, male writers, most of them because they are the prominent ones in the field, and started talking about, which are the female writers that we can invite. And you will be surprised to know that they were really not happy about this question, and there were rarely any names mentioned, because they thought there was a kind of they were being judgmental, because there was a kind of an impression that women do not write well, or the literary circles in Saraiki culture are largely a male domain, and they kind of reinforce the fact that we want the literary scene in Saraiki language to be dominated by men. And I find that very problematic, because I've also met, I'm recently working on Saraiki women writers, and I've met writers who are attending public events, are politically conscious, but they tell me that their husbands would not allow it. And sometimes they're publishing with fake names, and they're not allowed to go out. They're so my I think, as an academic and as someone who's also a translator and working on Saraiki as a marginalized language, I feel that there is really no public discourse. There is no mentorship. There's no appreciation of female narrative voices. There is no authenticity given to them. So I think, coming back to our question on translation, I mean, in the current scenario, in the context of Saraiki culture, translation is way beyond our imagination, because even if you think of the Sufi texts, which are the most popular literary form, or literary collections, or they are archived and all that, but you rarely find much material on Saraiki women, female Sufis who are Saraiki, who were writing in Saraiki. I don't know of any. And most importantly for me, as a Pakistani, as a modern Saraiki woman, I think the biggest problem is there is no mentorship, there is no public discourse, and there is no initiative and incentive for women belonging to marginalized languages and cultures to get their voices heard through translation. And because I see translation as a act of resistance. It's a political activity. It's carrying your culture beyond the limits and roots of that box in which people see you, or that the idea of stereotyping certain identity. So we have a lot to do and move ahead with it. But I think it's a point of it should be a point of concern, particularly in the context of Pakistan. That perhaps I just gave one example because I work on Saraiki literature, but there are many other languages as well in which the women are never heard and their works are not translated.
Thank you, Dr. Langhah. That I completely agree with you, and myself being a Saraiki, I do feel and empathize with your pain, and I think we do need to pick up the mantle and carry on. Before we wrap up, I have one question which I'm going to throw out to all three ladies. We'll have to answer it because we're running out of time. This is from Abdul Wahid, who asks, I have a question, and that is related to how far can we make good literature, i.e. Urdu literature or any other literature for that matter, to the young girls in the peripheries. Young girls are exposed more to literature such as by Umaira Ahmed compared to one by Khatija Mastoor or Sara Shagufta. So, Dr. Yaqin, if you could take the lead, how do we make literature more accessible to young girls, please? And then Mina, I'd like to hear from you, and finally Dr. Langhah.
Okay, so I've read both those authors, and I think there are very different styles of writing, and there is a certain ease to reading the the sort of newer writer than there is to Khatija Mastoor. But I think it's a really good question, and one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, to what degree are we allowed to be critical thinkers within Pakistan, to be able to make the judgment about storytelling and narrative, to be, to get into because when you're young, popular culture has a big influence on you, and you are peer pressure and all those things play a big part in how and what you do. So I think those types of choices are not made like in isolation. They're made as part of a bigger sort of thing that you're a part of. I know certainly from when I was educated in Pakistan, and I had, I was in very privileged places, so I'm not complaining, but certainly even in those privileged places, I remember in sort of college, our economics teacher said, don't ask questions, and because that's the path to problems. And it's something that stayed with me for a very long time, to say, well, why can't we ask questions? Because if we're not allowed to ask questions, then that's what puts us off our own literature, our own culture. I mean, I think our oral cultural traditions are not something that we can overlook as well. I mean, certainly when I grew up, my grandmother, who actually didn't have a full education, she would say to us, I've done my primary, and you guys, you've done GCSE, whatever. You think you can tell me how to live, what education is. And I think that's such, and she was saying this in Punjabi, so you've got to imagine this in Punjabi. So it's so important, that we don't over kind of think the project of education in that way, and really kind of broaden it and open it out, and embrace people across class divides, and really reach out and make those things more possible for, critical thinking more possible. And I don't know what the solution to that is, because even here in this country, we're seeing a downturn on critical thinking, because politicians don't like critical thinking, because you want a populace that will just do what you want them to do. So, and women's empowerment and women's, I mean, it's not everybody's let's hope that nobody gets into the situation that Malala did, and not everybody is going to be rescued in the same way that Malala was, right? We know that a lot of girls are not, and they face similar fates, and what happens to them, and what is their so a story can really kind of be part of yourself, building your self-esteem, building your narrative, building yourself. And so we have to work and see across this project that you're doing, that Anke is doing, the work that Nukhbah is doing, that Mina is doing, to see how we can come together as in a collective formation to try and work across those spaces.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Mina, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Well, in a very sort of practical way, I find it interesting that a man has asked this question for the young girls. So it's like, maybe, I don't know if it's prescriptive or not, but it just in the very bare bones of it, accessibility. The internet is your friend. The internet has everything on it. Like I remember in Lahore where getting books was next to impossible unless you bought them. And then you were obviously at the mercy of somebody who had the money to buy you a book, and you just have to wait. So I would say school libraries and university libraries, and the internet. Use it. Read as much as you can. And if you have a sibling, if you have a brother who can go out and buy you a book, then please, brothers who are listening to this, go and buy your sister's books and read them yourself too. All of you should be reading them. And you've got the power. You can do it.
Absolutely. Dr. Langhah, would you share your thoughts?
Yes, Mehr, I think as someone who's a promoter of languages in Pakistan, I would say that one must have access to literature written in their own mother language, because my theory as a teacher of literature is that if you do not read and appreciate your own literature, you're never going to be able to understand any kind of literature in the world. So I would say that if you do not have access to mainstream or languages which represent the high culture, you should at least have access, make access to the locally published literature, because this is how you can develop people's interest and passion for literature.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way of putting it. We're near the end of our session. Thank you so much, Dr. Yaqin, Dr. Langhah, Mina. It's been wonderful. There's so much more that I want to ask, but unfortunately there's not much time left. So thank you so very much. And I look forward to all the literary work that the three of you are going to produce. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, Mehr and Anke. This is wonderful.
Not at all. Thank you.